And that forces us then over to the other side of the disjunction here. Obviously, if God is not disorderly, then God is orderly, canceling out the double negatives there, and that makes more sense. God is intelligent, and God's intelligence is a kind of order. God is a powerful being, able to exert his will on the universe, and that's a kind of ordering function. That's a reflection of who he is. But then there's a problem here. If we then say that God is orderly, then, according to line 2, anything that's complexly ordered requires an orderer. It would seem to follow that God, as an orderly being, would himself require an orderer. And this is a problem. Just to recapitulate the logic here. If we say that God is orderly and orderly things require an orderer, then it follows that God requires an orderer. It's the exact same logic applied to God that we, in this argument here, applied to the universe. Now, what's problematic about this is that if we then continue to use the logic of the argument as developed over here, we would then say, well, what kind of an orderer would have to exist in order to bring and order God, right, into existence? Where does God's order, right, come from? Then we would have to say, well, it has to be a being that's even more intelligent than God and more powerful than God. And so we would be saying something like then, so therefore a super God exists. Right. And that super God brought God's order into existence, and then God brings the universe's order into existence. But then we have, of course, a problem, because then we would just make the exact same question with respect to this line here. What about this super God? Is it orderly or not? Well, we can't say it's disorderly, so it must be orderly. But then if it's orderly, it must require an orderer itself. And what kind of a being would that have to be? Well, then it would have to be a super duper God, right? An even more powerful and a more intelligent God. And we would say the same thing about that God. And what we then have is an infinite regress. Right? And that's bad. We don't want to have an infinite regress of super God, super duper God, super duper duper God, right, on so forth, because then we don't end up explaining anything. And it just seems ridiculous to say that we have an infinite chain of increasingly superior gods to try to explain the phenomenon of the existing universe. Now, of course, then we have a dilemma here, and so far the lines that we have developed are unsatisfactory in both cases. And once this infinite regress is pointed out here, people who then want to defend the argument from design will then say, okay, well, yeah, obviously in our theology we don't want to say that God requires an orderer, so in some sense we need to break the regress. And so what we then do is say something like the following: it's not the case that God has an orderer. We'll just break the chain right at this point here. Instead, we will say something like God is self-ordering. Right? And in that case, he's an exception to line 2. Right? 2. Everything in the universe, right, that's orderly requires an orderer except God. God can order himself, and so he is the one and only exception to this general trait here. And therefore, we break the infinite regress, and we have still a satisfactory explanation. Of course, this is a problematic move in its own right and subject to criticism, because the people who are not sympathetic to the argument are simply then going to say, well, you know, if you have an argument that you've laid out here, but then you start making exceptions to the argument in order to save your theology, that's a bit problematic here. And if we're going to start saying that there are things that are self-ordering or that have their own internal principles of ordering, why do we not then just say that, well, the universe has that, right? The universe is a self-ordering system, and we don't then need to appeal to external beings like gods in order to do so. And certainly evolutionary theory is just one such example. It sees the universe as an internally self-organizing system. And so if we're going to have to say, well, something has to be self-ordering, and it's either the universe is self-ordering, as the evolutionary model says, or the universe is not self-ordering, it requires an external orderer that is itself self-ordering, and that's where we stop and make the exception. Which of those two models then is going to be a stronger model? All right, the debate then goes on. This is simply to point out, or perhaps not so simply to point out, that there are a lot of fun and complicated issues involved in the argument from design. What we've done through is laid the argument out in fairly sympathetic form, in strong form, in a step-by-step fashion. Then we went through systematically raising possible critical questions for each of the steps of the argument. Then one fairly strong counter-argument that's in the form of a dilemma here. And we work through what can and cannot be said on the basis of that. And then we're left with a question. I will just leave it as a question. Both sides of the argument do make the claim that something is self-ordering. Either the universe is self-ordering, and we don't need to appeal to a God, or the universe can't be self-ordering, and we do appeal to a self-ordering God, and that's our ultimate explanation. The next step of the argument then would be to think through those two claims, which one is better, and that's fun, interesting, and another metaphysical project. For the purposes of this course, though, our purpose is to look at one strong argument for the existence of God. In the next unit, what we want to do is turn to one strong argument against the existence of God, and we'll go through the same process again.